Hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about competitive advantage and business level strategies in different kinds of markets or industries. And the challenge is that we need to cover 3 chapters. I don't want my lecture to continue for 5 hours, so I had to think what to present, what not to present in this week's session. And bear with me, understand that I will not be able to cover everything, so reading the chapters is essential. And I may also touch on some things that are not discussed in detail by the book. So, I encourage you to pay attention, but this is definitely not a substitute to reading the chapters. So, the slides. As usual, we have quite a program for today. I will talk about the industry life cycle, technology development and adoption, how you capture value from innovation. We'll talk about dominant designs and standards, which is extremely important as industries go through this growth and maturity stage. We'll talk about organizing the firm for innovation, managing risks associated with innovation, and we'll also talk about accessing innovative ideas from outside of the firm, because obviously, you cannot come up with all the great ideas on your own. Sometimes they reside elsewhere, so you need to be able to capture them and be able to employ them within your company. We'll talk about industry structure and competition over time, what changes, what remains the same, dealing with change, because that is very tricky and many companies find it problematic to respond to the change, right? There are all those forces of inertia and myopia that managers are dealing with. So we'll try to identify the strategies that work. And finally, we'll spend some time talking about mature and declining industries and whether or not there's anything you can do to still get a decent performance if you happen to be in one of the industries that is facing decline. The short answer is yes, so bear with me and we'll talk about how to do it. So first of all, the industry life cycle. Um, Obviously, industries have a beginning, and even the industries that we think of haven't been around for ages, at some point were brand new. So industries go through 4 main stages in their development and evolution: introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. And not every industry makes it, right? There are some industries that, not every industry makes it necessarily in a direct linear fashion. So if you think about, your smartphones, which are essentially palm-held devices, computers, if you will. There have been several attempts to create a similar technology previously, Palm Pilot and things of that nature, that have been introduced but have failed to grow and to create an industry with it, right? So a creation of an innovative product does not necessarily create a new industry, but it may happen as well. And if the industry is created, typically it goes through these 4 basic stages. Industry evolution is subject to 2 primary forces: demand growth, which is what most of us understand and can envision rather easily. The other driving force for the industry evolution is the creation and diffusion of knowledge. That is not necessarily seen by us, the users. We deal with products, not necessarily with technologies. And typically, when the industry is young, there is a proliferation of technologies and different standards, which over time coalesce to a certain set of standards that emerge as, de facto standards or mandate standards. They usually emerge as a dominant design for a specific product, and then the industry goes through this growth, maturity, and decline stage. The development of technology typically goes again through several stages. Everything in strategy is kind of easy to guess if you put your mind to it. It all starts with basic knowledge, that individuals, typically creative individuals, somehow combine and come up with inventions, right? So an idea for a new product, or even the new product itself, by itself, is not an innovation. Innovation is something that you actually put to the market, that you present to the market, which is either met with a decent reception or is not. But all those patents that companies have, the vast majority of them, even though they do reflect inventions, never make it to the innovation stage. There are multiple reasons why companies invest in inventions and never turn those products into innovations. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But once there is this innovation that's introduced to the market, uh, two forces on the supply side and the demand side cause it to diffuse. Right? On the supply side, if there are indications that this new innovation is successful, you have imitation. And previously we talked about how important it is to protect your business from imitation and how you do that, how you disguise your performance, how you try to implement causal ambiguity and tacitness and all of that. On the demand side, what helps with diffusion is adoption by users. As more and more people sign up, obviously the product diffuses and becomes a sort of a new norm. Again, think of smartphones. It took the industry some time to reach the point where most people now have them. And that was a very strong force in making this technology diffuse. With respect to the technology adoption curve, we talked previously about industry evolution, but there is this similar kind of shape or curve for the adoption of technologies. Initially, you have a very small minority of people, estimated to be at about 2.5%, who are the innovators. They are excited about new technologies, they like trying new products, and they generate a lot of useful feedback for companies that manufacture new products. This is followed by the so-called early adopters. So 13.5% more people start adopting early on in a new product's life. And then, so after this 16% combined, innovators and early adopters sort of endorse the product, you have early majority and late majority, about 34% of population each. And then finally, you have some laggards, right? The remaining 16% who really jump on this train in the last wagon. And that's just the way it is. So each of these groups of adopters have different motivations. They have unique characteristics depending on where the product is on this life cycle, on this adoption curve. You should emphasize certain features. You would try to reach out to these customers in unique ways, right? So for laggards, think about your grandma adopting a smartphone. It's definitely a very different strategy that you need to sign them up compared to early adopters, people who like to see themselves at forefront and who are probably more forgiving of some of the technical challenges and dealing with innovation. So again, depending on where the product is or the technology is with respect to the adoption curve, your strategic options would be different. So this obviously is all good and well. The big question is, how do you capture value from innovation? We tend to talk about innovation as if it is valuable in and of itself, and for customers, that may actually be the case. But as a company, your perspective is different. You have to be able to capture some portion of that innovation, of value that the innovation creates for yourself and for your shareholders. Only then would that be justified. So possible beneficiaries to innovation include innovators, followers, suppliers, and customers. Obviously, we are concerned primarily with innovators, as the ones who come up with those new technologies, what can they do to appropriate a portion of the benefits? And it turns out that a lot really depends on the appropriability regime in the industry. The appropriability regime describes how likely you are to capture a substantial chunk of the value you create for yourself. And it consists of, so it can be tight or loose, or strong or weak. Different labels are used to describe the appropriability regime. There are four specific elements that contribute to the strength of the appropriability regime. The one that is probably easiest to grasp is property rights, right? The extent to which property rights are protected. And this includes things like patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets. Patents, obviously, they grant you a temporary monopoly to exploit a specific technological design. There are different kinds of patents. What we are interested in is so-called utility patents. And typically, they grant the innovator a 14 to 17-year monopoly on exploiting this specific technological design or resource combination. In some industries, this is enough to enable the company to capture most of the value created. In other industries, companies find it very easy to what they call invent around. So by doing some minor changes, tweaks to the technology that is disclosed in a patent application, they effectively claim a very similar one as their own, and somehow are able to get away with it. So I believe I have discussed in some detail the competitive rivalry between IBM and AMD in the past, where Intel and AMD in the past, where Intel will come up with a technologically advanced processor, AMD will reverse engineer it, and will be able to come up with a clone version of it with some changes about 6 months later. And apparently that was legal. Whatever modifications they were introducing to that new technological design were sufficient to get Intel off their back. And AMD has enjoyed a very strong second position in that market. Copyrights obviously is for the creative work. So, books, articles, software, I believe, is covered by copyrights as well. If the copyright protection is strong, again, you stand a great chance to benefit from your innovation. If not, it can be imitated quite easily, and your imitators will appropriate a big chunk of that value for themselves. Trademarks, well, that helps greatly with strengthening your brand and establishing yourself as a differentiated player in the market. And as a differentiator, you typically can get price premiums for the products that you sell. Finally, trade secrets. The big issue with using patents, copyrights, or trademarks, especially patents, is that you have to disclose that information that you're applying for monopolistic protection for. Sometimes it makes more sense to simply keep it quiet, keep it secret, in the hopes that your would-be imitators will not be able to necessarily decipher what enables you to have above average performance, right? So Coca-Cola, for instance, keeps its syrup recipe a secret because, once it's out, once the secret is out, everybody can imitate it, and the protection will only last so long. By keeping it a trade secret, it guarantees this uniqueness for many, many years to come. The other thing is that helps you appropriate value of your innovation is if there's a lot of testedness and complexity embedded in your technology. So even if you disclose the technology through patent application, it does not necessarily help potential rivals um, if they cannot understand fully how it is done, right? So there's a difference between know what and know how. So you may disclose know what, but without knowing how to do it, they may not be able to necessarily replicate it. That happens in one of the two conditions. One is if a lot of components of the technologies are tacit, that is non-codifiable, so you sort of have to experience it, be part of the culture to understand how things work. The other thing is just complexity, right? There may be some wonderfully productive technologies that I can find a patent for, but I may not be able to decipher exactly what is needed. Or, again, um, think about the difficulties that many Chinese high-tech companies are experiencing currently when the US government all of a sudden put a lot of uh, limitations and constraints on a US company in terms of sharing the technology. Right? They may have access to those same patents that the US companies have, right? All those patents are open, they available to the public, but they may not be able to replicate that same thing for themselves, right? For cell phone manufacturers, processors obviously are extremely important. And if the Chinese companies cannot get access to the US manufactured products or products that are made with US technology, they are in a very challenging position. So I guess we're going to see what happens to Huawei and whether or not it is able to find some adequate substitute for the processors that now it cannot access legally. So complexity of technology could be a good enough reason to protect it from imitation. Lead time is another big thing. So often it takes competitors several years to be able to fully understand and replicate the technology. If that happens, the company that has come up with an innovation has all this time to advance technology forward, right? To move the frontier. So by the time the technology is imitated, you are so far ahead. And that's exactly what was happening with Intel and AMD, right? With Intel coming up with new technologies, AMD would take about 6 months to catch up. Well, in that time, a new generation of processors will be available at Intel. So, the game kind of continues. And finally, complementary resources. Whether or not you have them, whether or not you have access to complementary resources, determines the extent to which you will be able to profit, to benefit from a specific innovation. And those complementary resources, they could be kind of generic, or they could be very, very specific. If they are specific and you don't control them, then you probably have to share a lot of the value that your technology generates with whoever owns those specific resources. Um, so it's kind of a bad thing, but then at the same time, if this technology requires highly specialized resources, you are also protected from imitation. So it grants you this extension of monopoly, a temporary monopoly that you have, and that's obviously a good thing. So what kind of complementary resources are we talking about here? So things like distribution network, manufacturing capability, customer service capability, complementary technologies, supplier relationships, brand, marketing capability, financial resources. You don't have to own all of that. And depending on the industry appropriability regime, you may actually choose to not develop any of those. So the textbook gives this example of biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies, and their business model for many years has been the same, right? The biotech companies come up with new drugs, And then pharmaceutical companies who have the manufacturing capabilities and who really know well how to work with different government agencies and doctors who prescribe medications. They have marketing capability and advertising. They sort of pick up where biotech companies leave off. And that works well for both parties. But again, industries such as these are few and far between. Now, the question I wanted to pose to you is, you know, why do companies patent? So we know that most patents are never acted upon, yet they cost substantial resources to develop. There's a interesting statistics I've looked at some point that says that I believe only about 16% of patented technologies are ever acted upon by the companies who came up with them or by the innovators, and only about 1% of all patents generate commercial value to ever speak of. So why would companies engage in disclosing their idea to the public through patenting? And it turns out that there are multiple reasons to do it, and not each of them has to do with capturing value from the innovation as such. Some companies do it to just measure performance. If you are a research institute, that's the ultimate metrics, right? This just provides some approximation for how smart you are, how technologically advanced you are, right? So the patent portfolio is helpful in this regard. If you are a startup, an early stage startup, and you probably rely on venture capital for product development and growth, this is how you can signal the value of your ideas, right? That it warrants patent, and that you show this portfolio saying that this is what we do. You also do that to enhance reputation. Obviously, if your patent portfolio is strong, it tells something to the market, and the market responds. You may use it in negotiations, both for established companies and for startups. That could be a very strong piece. You do that to block others. So you may have a patent that you choose not to act on simply to prevent a competitor to pursue the same idea. And because in strategic management we talk about above average returns, so your performance is always compared to that of your rivals. So if you can create problems for your rivals, even if it does not help you directly and necessarily, you do that. And patenting could be a strong tool to use for this purpose. Sometimes you do it to prevent lawsuits. So with a patent, you can claim that this is actually yours. So you're protected if anyone ever challenges you. You may do that for licensing revenues, right? There are many companies that generate substantial amounts from licensing their patents out. IBM, again, I believe, was generating close to $1 billion a year from just licensing out its patents that previously have just been collecting dust on the shelves. And obviously, to prevent copying, this is probably the main reason why companies do that, but definitely not the only one. As industries evolve and mature over time, the focus of innovation changes. Early on, most innovation that we talk about is product innovation, right? So obviously we talk about new technologies, we talk about new ways of doing things, but it's primarily about coming up with new products, right? For early stage industries, we are primarily interested in differentiation to be able to upcharge our products. That comes from product innovation. As industries evolve, go through growth into maturity, we start seeing more and more of process innovation. Process innovation primarily helps you manage the costs. So as industry matures, the nature of competition switches away from differentiation towards cost leadership, and process innovation becomes very important. In the early stages of industry life, there are typically multiple versions of the same product. There are multiple standards that are possible for companies to consider. So there's a rapid development of product technologies. At some point, however, two things happen. One is there's this dominant design that emerges, right? If you think about bikes, I have this picture here of a really old one. Early on in the life of that product, bikes did not look very much like what they look like today. So it took a series of errors and trials to find a design that was, I guess, effective. Once that happened, the industry changed, right? Again, the nature of competition changed, and even though there are multiple innovations to this day in the bike space, the dominant design does not change. Nobody usually owns dominant design. It happens to just emerge through a natural process. But once it emerges, the next thing that emerges is technical standards, right? Once the industry agrees on a product design, then the standardization starts. And we may talk about different kinds of standards. Some of them are public. They could be mandatory. They could be just demanded by the government, or the specific industry could be regulated tightly. And so the standards are provided to ensure that the industry functions the way the government wants. Some of the standards are private, right? So-called proprietary standards. Again, the textbook gives the example of a PDF file standard owned by the Adobe Corporation. So if you happen to control a technical standard, that is obviously a very powerful thing, because you can expect to appropriate pretty much the value of each transaction that happens in your industry, as long as other companies are forced or have to use your design. They stand to gain tremendously. The other thing that emerges with this appearance of technical standards is so-called network effects. And again, we've mentioned them before briefly. I just want to touch on them one more time. So network effects emerge when there are multiple users linked to a network. And networks are only possible if there are technical standards that already exist. Right? So again, think about your phones. The primary goal of having a phone is being able to talk to other people who have phones. So the more people have it, the more value this specific technology has for you. So that's the network effect. If you control the standard that comes with this specific technology, as the installed base of users grows, the benefits for your company grow as well. Availability of complements helps a great deal and is a part of those network effects. So for our smartphones, apps will be complementary products. The more complementary products there are, the more people are interested in owning the product, the more value you can get from this innovation, from this product, if you control the standards. Right? For that industry, Apple is so adamant about keeping the iPhone standards proprietary, because it manages to capture a big chunk of value that all those complementary products create, right? So you probably know that it charges about 30% of value that apps generate, with developers only getting 70%. So the industry is not terribly excited about it, but that's the nature of the beast. There's not much you can do about it. So once the network is in place, people are typically tied to a standard if there are switching costs implied by this technology. Um, we have talked previously, and the textbook mentions now the type of keyword that we use. It was initially designed to slow you down, but now once we've learned it, the companies that sort of own this specific layout can expect to benefit from having control of that standard in the long run. Phones, the same thing. I believe I mentioned that I bought my first iPhone, it was iPhone 4S, without much thinking, without doing much research. But at the end of the day, I've tried switching away from the Apple infrastructure, and I'm reluctant to do it because I don't want to lose all my music. Right? So to me, that would be switching costs. And I know that I can probably find all of it if I switch to Android. There are MP3s freely available on the web. I can probably find more music that I like, but switching costs. I'm not willing to incur them, so I stay with the technology, even if I'm not terribly happy with some aspects of that technology. And as a result, if there is a strong standard, dominant design standard in the market you operate in, you may get the so-called winner takes all kind of market, where there would be one or two companies that claim most of the benefits, most of the value generated by the product, and everybody else just barely getting by. How do you compete for establishing your own standard? Well, first of all, forget about what Apple does, right? So it tries to control everything single-handedly. Most companies cannot do that. Most companies, if they want to establish a standard, they need allies, and they need them early on. So most recently, there was the standards war in a high-definition DVD space. There were two standards, HD DVD and Blu-ray by Sony. And both standards try to sign up as many partners as possible among other technology companies and among studios that were manufacturing content to use their own standards. So in this case, Sony has won. It was able to establish a strong technological standards that other companies backed up and studios backed up. In the past, Sony has not been terribly successful with establishing a standard in the industry. So that essentially the same market, is the video recording market. I don't know if you guys remember those VHS tapes, huge tapes. They would last about 180 minutes, 3 hours. And so you can put up to two movies on one cassette. That standard, that technology was actually inferior to the technology owned by Sony, the so-called Sony Betamax. But Sony was trying to control it very tightly. It did not really work with other companies, encouraging them to adopt the standard. It did not work creatively and consistently with studios. So studios were interested in supporting a standard that would host longer movies. Sony Betamax was initially meant for just your private recording, like parents shot in a tape of the child playing or something like that. So Betamax, because they did not work with other partners, failed to see the need to make the tape longer than 1 hour. And that was one of the main reasons why an alternative standard has been chosen by major industry players. So you need allies. You want to preempt the market. You want to come in early. You want to reach out as far as you can. You want to establish your presence and maybe, do things like promotional pricing or something like that. So it is very expensive in the face of uncertainty. So it's risky. It's always easy to look back and say, this is why this specific strategy succeeded, or this product succeeded, and that other one has not. But yeah, it's huge uncertainty that you have to deal with. You have to manage expectations, right? So you have to tell the market what you bring in, how great the product is. So this is something that Apple is doing very successfully and has been doing for a while. And well, obviously, you have to have control over intellectual property in question. You want to engage in continuous innovation to maintain technological advance. And as you do that, so there's always this desire, once you have control over this group, huge group of customers, uh, move to technology that is not backward compatible, so that, like if you sell on processors like Intel and you switch from 32-bit processors to 64-bit processors, you would also encourage them to update all of the software. And if you do that successfully, then obviously you get full control with 100% of the market. But most users are reluctant to go with changes of this nature. So you basically want, as you invest in new technological development, to ensure backward compatibility. You want to move in early. Again, we've discussed it before, and it seems that in most cases, early movers are not the ones who enjoy all the benefits. Yet, if you do it right, then obviously you get you get control over a really attractive market early on, while people are paying a lot of money. So the benefits to you and to your customers will be of a very different magnitude. Strengths and complements, that's definitely something that companies like Apple and Google with Android have done. So apps are extremely important, and they help to establish the very strong competitive position for their products and reputation and brand name. Right? So if there are two alternative products that are introduced to the market, one by a very reputable company, the other one is by an unknown startup, chances are users will be more comfortable going with a reputable company. So invest in reputation, investing in your brand is a good idea. It turns out you may also organize specifically for innovation. You may structure your company in a way that promotes innovation. So to that end, you want to have a flat organization without hierarchical control. So as we were talking about organization structures, we compared mechanistic and organic organizations. Essentially, you want to build an organic structure for your organization, right? So flat organization, task-oriented project teams, fuzzy organizational boundaries. You allow for ideas to cross the organization both in and out. Um, you encourage trials and errors for the organization, so as to enhance variation, so you have something to choose from. Loose control to foster idea generation, flexible strategic planning, sort of flexible financial control, autonomy recognition. So all of those are other wonderful things. Companies that we all agree are innovative, many of them actually pay employees to do whatever they want. So obviously not 100% of the time, but I believe that Google, up to 20% of employees' time is paid for when they don't need to, report on any projects that they've been tasked with by their bosses. So they choose on projects of the liking. 3M is doing the same thing and has been doing it for decades. And many successful projects are the result of such an organization of the working time. So again, the classical example is post-it notes. I might have mentioned that previously in one of my lectures, right? That the company has know-how in like bonding materials. And so they came up with a glue that wouldn't really bond. Rather than discarding the idea, they let the employee who came up with it to find this alternative product idea for it. And look what happened. This is the product that all of us use multiple times throughout our lives, and it's been very successful. So because the company allows people to do their pet projects, it encourages creativity and innovativeness. And for managers, they should really be more of sponsors and orchestrators rather than autocrats that just make sure procedures are followed. So the organizing for innovation is a very unique task. We know how to do it, yet not every company can do it because people are different, cultures are different. So this is something that you want to pay close attention to if you want to emphasize innovativeness for your company. Obviously, innovation is risky. There are two main sources of risk that you should be aware of: technological uncertainty and market uncertainty. With respect to technological uncertainty, as they say in economics, the nature of innovation is ill-defined. When you first start an innovative project, research project, you have no idea what kind of technology you're going to come up with. And in fact, a great number of technologies that we have today are the results of accidental discoveries, or something else was aimed at, but just a completely unexpected technology emerged. So that Monsanto product, the evil company Monsanto, as the sort of public calls it, NutraSweet, a sugar substitute. So the company that came up with NutraSweet and was eventually bought by Monsanto was a medical company, and their scientists have been working on ulcer treatment. Now, so they come up with this compound, the powder. I don't know whatever prompted one of the scientists to just, taste it. I don't know what kind of effects he was expecting, but he realized that the product was incredibly sweet. And back then, there were no sugar substitutes without the bitter aftertaste. So the guy in charge of the company, who was none other but Don Rumsfeld, later became Defense Secretary of the United States, at the time he recognized that there is huge market potential for this technology. And even though they were not a food company, why they have switched to pursue this technology. They've been very successful, eventually sold it to Monsanto. And as they say, the rest is history. But technologically, you could never have expected this product to come from research on ulcers, right? So technological uncertainty is a big deal. There's also market uncertainty. If you come up with a product that's generally novel, you have no idea if the market would accept it or not. So we already talked about Palm Pilots and other PDAs, personal digital assistants. When they were just introduced, no one wanted them. Electric cars have been around actually before internal combustion engine cars, right? So early in the 20th century, maybe even late 19th century. Nobody wanted them back then, and for the next 100 years, no one really paid attention until Tesla, right? So we don't really know whether or not the market will accept something, which makes it very risky to invest in new technology. You can employ several different strategies to manage risks. One is you try to cooperate with lead users. So I showed you that slide before. There's about 2.5% of users who are truly innovative, who are ready to try new products, who are interested in new products. I'll work with them. They would probably do it for free. They would be excited to work with you, and you can harvest a lot of insights from those people that you would benefit from. In fact, this strategy of employing users in product development has recently been adopted by a great number of companies. So not only do they source interesting ideas from lead users, but also what happens is users, so escalation of commitment. If you as a user see that the company listens to you and adopts your ideas, chances are you're going to be very loyal to that company, to that product. You'll probably talk all your friends and colleagues into using that product as well, right? So there are different strategies you can use to improve the quality of new technologies, but also improve market adoption. So it helps you with both technological uncertainty and market uncertainty. You try to limit risk exposure by keeping just, I guess, financial risk exposure by keeping your investments to a minimum. And for that reason, many companies, large companies, rather than doing all the R&D themselves, start investing in small startups with potential interesting technologies, right? So what they do is they never acquire those companies right away. They buy small equity stakes in those companies, so up to 20%, never more, basically to keep it as a window on technology. And if they see something that is potentially worthy of further investment and development, then there are different options to consider, right? From misappropriating the technology and then having to go through lawsuits with that startup, to acquiring the technology outright, or to maybe cooperating with this new venture. But again, that depends on what's important to you and how you plan to build the infrastructure around your company. You try to be flexible as you work with technologies. You never commit to just one use for that technological idea. You consider multiple alternatives. Again, the textbook provides the example of Twitter, the company that sort of developed from another startup called Audio. So Twitter, the technology behind Twitter was initially designed as an internal communication mechanism for employees of Audio company. And then those employees realized that that was extremely convenient and decided to sort of spun it out as its own product, as its own company, and the rest is history. And then also, if you are a large company, you don't have to choose just one strategy, right? You can pursue multiple strategies with multiple divisions, see what works, what doesn't, and obviously commit to something that works and uncommit from something that doesn't. So you can manage those risks that are embedded in any innovative endeavor. You also realize that some of the great ideas, they do exist outside of your company, and that some of the ideas that you have can never be commercialized within your company, but may have a bright future outside. So what do you do with those external sources of innovation? Well, you open up to them. I think I have probably mentioned open innovation here previously. The idea is that you recognize that your competitors could be a source of your next innovative idea. Or maybe you go to the university and see what kind of research professors in the engineering department or physics or chemistry are doing. So in one of my prior institutions, we had a really well-developed liquid crystals institute with scientists coming up with innovative ideas of great market potential. A lot of companies were providing research funds to that liquid crystal institute. They were working actively with scientists, not because they did not have their own R&D units, but because they realize that a lot of great ideas could exist outside of the companies. You may buy innovation, obviously, right? From licensing patents to buying companies that have innovative ideas. And you also try to organize yourself for innovation, right? So we talked previously about how to structure the company, having a flat structure and certain processes within. But it is also very essential to have cross-functional product development teams. As we talked about organization structures and specifically functional structure, we said that those tend to become silos over time, and your marketing people don't necessarily communicate with your engineering people very well or very actively, and whenever they do, they fight rather than share ideas. So if you create cross-functional product teams, so this resembles the matrix structure, that can help. That can help to ensure that people are actually on the same page and do something that leads to new innovative products development. You want to have product champions, someone who sort of owns the product, and companies that are innovative typically they typically allow people to be in charge of their own innovative ideas, right? So 3M with Post-it notes is a classic example. Gore-Tex, right? The company that so they have that material that is breathable but does not let water through. So it's really good for footwear and clothes. But the ideas that their people come up with, they have value for multiple industries. So one of the people who works for Gore-Tex decided that whatever that material that they had patent for could be used for guitar strings, and apparently it could. And apparently the company has come up with a innovative product with superior properties that leading musicians are now use. And who would have thought, right? That because there was someone who cared about the project and the company supported that initiative, it generated a brand new division within Gore-Tex that was dealing with this previously uncharted territory, the new market. And also corporate incubators, right? You sometimes create those units within a corporation whose job it is to help innovative ideas of their employees to see them to fruition, right? So you help with office space, access to some resources, you facilitate idea exchange, provide some funding, and quite often it works wonderfully. Now, as the industry evolves, as it goes from introduction through growth to maturity to decline, a lot of things change, right? The demand conditions change a lot. Early on, they are limited to early adopters, right? The demand is limited to early adopters, usually high-income people, maybe, somewhat loose in important ways, who are excited about trying new things. In the growth stage, demand is goes up rapidly and market penetration goes up. At the maturity stage, you're dealing with mass market. So you primarily at this point, people don't necessarily want new, better things. They simply replace the products that they already have, right? There is a life cycle for products, and as it breaks down, as it, I don't know, maybe there's new technology that makes it more efficient. They replace the old ones. Maybe it's just fashion, but that's just it, right? So the nature of demand at the maturity stage is very different. And at the decline stage, obviously you're dealing with obsolescence, demand goes down, and your biggest challenge is probably managing excess capacity. With respect to technology, early on, there's many competing technologies, rapid product innovation. As you reach growth stage, There is some standardization around dominant technology. There are standards emerging. At the maturity stage, know-how has been diffused within the industry. So, really anything that happens, like all the advancement that happen, probably have to do more with process improvement rather than product improvement. And at the decline stage, it's like nothing happens at all. You just harvest what you have and you forget about everything else. With respect to products, when the industry is young, products are of poor quality, they typically expensive, they offer a variety of features. No one really knows if those features are demanded or not. They haven't really coalesced to a specific dominant design just yet. At that point, competing on cost leadership makes no sense whatsoever. So if the industry is young and at the introduction stage, you definitely want to compete on differentiation, never on cost leadership. At the growth stage, design and quality improves. So there is this dominant design that gradually emerges. At the maturity stage, there's trend to commoditization. So everything becomes super standardized. You may try to differentiate through brand and quality and bundling, but that is complicated. And decline stage, really, commodity is the norm, and differentiation is difficult and typically unprofitable. So I would refer you to the textbook. It talks about conditions in manufacturing and distribution, trade, competition, and key success factors in each of those stages. So please get familiar with that and read about it, think what it means for industries and for companies. The only thing I want to mention here is that in the maturity stage, and to a lesser extent, growth stage, as the product gets standardized, manufacturing typically gets outsourced to lower cost countries. We tend to think of those as typically, providing cheap labor. That's not the only thing, right? If your product if the processes you employ are damaging the environment, environmental compliance in the United States or, Western Europe can be very expensive. So sometimes you outsource the manufacturing to other countries, not because of the cheap labor, but because of the cost of compliance with environmental requirements. And if those same countries provide both cheap labor and lax environmental laws, then it makes it very obvious that manufacturing will be outsourced there. So just something to keep in mind. With respect to technological change, initially again it's very frequent. Uh, Not all of it is good for the companies. Um, in the most basic sense, some technical changes are competence enhancing. They enable you to sort of increase your technological advancement, and they increase the value of your capabilities and your technological portfolio. Sometimes technological change is competence destroying, right? You may develop this greatest technology to do something, but if there's an alternative way of doing things that gives people more and costs less, then it doesn't really matter how good you are with a specific technology. People will just vote with their wallets elsewhere. Innovation could be architectural or component. Architectural innovation implies that the basic design of the product has changed, and that puts established companies at a disadvantage. Because as you remember from our previous discussions, it's a good idea to keep investing in your capabilities and competencies, because this is what sets you apart from the rest of the pack. and this is what gives you a sustainable competitive advantage. While with architectural innovation, what you have may become obsolete, right? The market may move elsewhere. You may not necessarily be happy that that kind of innovation has happened. Component innovation, on the other hand, enables you to improve your performance substantially, right? So if there is no architectural innovation, if the nature of the product hasn't changed and the way it's put together hasn't changed, if you're making computers and there's a better processor available, that's good, right? So that's strengthen your position. Some new technologies are sustaining, some disruptive. So obviously, same kind of challenges there. And to manage change, you need to develop organizational ambidexterity. So you have to be able to both exploit what you have in the best possible way and explore new opportunities, new markets, new technologies, right? So this balance between exploitation and exploration is the essence of organizational ambidexterity. And as much as we like to look into the future, we cannot abandon the present, right? We use the present to finance the future in a way that would enable us to develop and sustain competitive advantage when that future comes. In terms of organizing for ambidexterity, there are two possible ways. One is the so-called structural ambidexterity. You may simply create units within an organization that deal with certain new technologies. You have probably heard about skunkworks projects, where a company, especially as it tries to develop something new, will create a new organizational unit, will give it some budget, and will sort of, let them be. Those people work among themselves, having very little contact with the mother organization until they come up or not with a product that meets certain expectations. And this autonomy and the new culture that develops within that unit often enables organizations to explore new opportunities while protecting the rest of the company and allowing it to exploit what has been developed in the past. Contextual ambidexterity is when you do not create that same unit, but you try to change the organizational culture, you try to encourage people to innovate within the company. So it's a different approach. Right? It's probably a bit harder to manage because you have to change the culture within the entire organization. But if you manage to do that well, then obviously your organization will probably be better positioned to meet the future. Organizations typically do not like to change. Right? They are subject to organizational inertia. They have their own routines that tend to turn into competency traps. Right? Something we referred to previously as core rigidities. Again, it's a good idea for them to keep investing in their core competencies, but as things around companies change, maybe those core competencies are not helping, right? So they become competency traps or rigidities. Organizations, they do consist of individuals, and with that comes the social structure and political structure, right? The interactions between people and the power relationship within the company. Those structures, they do resist change as well, right? So people like to maintain their power. They like to maintain a social structure. Change jeopardizes that, and so those structures resist. It is also known that over time, organizations within the industry start resembling each other, primarily to gain legitimacy, primarily because maybe they believe that this is the way to operate. So once they start adopting structures without really thinking about why, they commit themselves to the pursuit of similar strategies. And when companies have similar structures, pursue similar strategies, change is even harder, right? So competition tends to switch maybe to the basis of price, You look around, you see that everybody is doing the same. You see no reason for change. So you're shooting yourself in the foot until newcomers come and reorganize the way companies operate in the industry and take away your market from you. Um, People are boundedly rational. They do not necessarily search for optimizing at all times. So change is hard. People try to find the first solution that kind of works and stop there. So that is this management myopia and satisfaction as opposed to optimizing. And then finally, right in strategy, we talk about the notion of fit all the time. Fit between strategy, structure, and systems. If one of those elements change, it means that we have to change the remaining two elements with it. You cannot change the strategy without changing the structure. You cannot change the structure and expect that strategy will remain the same. And because there are so many moving parts, change is hard. So what can you do to combat organizational inertia and help the company deal with change? First of all, you create the perception of crisis throughout the organization. If people are comfortable, if there's no understanding that, you know, danger ahead, nothing will be done. If you create perception of crisis, people are more open to change. They would actually change willingly if they believe it's going to help themselves and the organization. You establish stretch targets, you kind of plan big, right? You're ambitious about your planning and about your goals. You create organizational initiatives, right? So when companies say that by year 2030 we're going to be a zero emission company, there's a reason for that, right? It's obviously PR device, but having that kind of initiative within the company facilitates change. And as people start rethinking their activities, they may find extra efficiency where none was expected previously. You reorganize company structure because structure is linked to strategy. With new structure, strategic changes will become inevitable. You typically have to change the leadership of the organization, right? So there's a reason why the average tenure of a CEO in the United States has gone down so dramatically over the past decades, right? So now I believe the average tenure of a CEO in a company is like 2.5 years. That's true for public companies, whereas previously we talked about decades. With new people come changes. So to combat organizational inertia, you may have to replace leadership. And you also engage in scenario analysis. The idea being is, if you know of a potential change, you can think it through. You may have strategies, those contingency strategies that you will be choosing from depending on where the situation goes. So that is essential. You oftentimes have to develop new capabilities when dealing with change and industry evolution. You have to put processes in place, the so-called organizational routines, such as training employees in the tools of innovation. You have to develop processes for idea generation, selection, and development. You put structures in place, such as cross-functional units. You work on people motivation, right? Change is hard. Developing new capabilities is hard. So you have to motivate people. You have to explain to them why it is that we have to do it and why it is good for them. Why not doing it is bad, right? So you create the sense of urgency and you have people sign up for the changes. You encourage organizational alignment, all right? So whenever you develop new capabilities, you want the rest of the organization to sort of embrace them. You want there to be shared culture. You want to make sure that whatever gets developed aligns well with the rest of the company. And you never try to develop all the capabilities at once. right? So you engage in development of capabilities sequentially, which means you have to prioritize what to develop and when, and go with that plan quite carefully. And finally, it's a great idea to try to develop dynamic capabilities. If you remember, these are the ones that allow the company to develop new capabilities, right? So that's the capability for the development of capabilities. If you know you go through changes, having this dynamic capability is great, right? So you want to dedicate yourself to creating this culture within the organization, processes and structures that would enable you to develop new capabilities as the need arises. Now, that was true uh, for the early stages of industry existence, the growth stages. But what do you do when the industry matures? Well, several things happen in mature industries. First of all, scope for differentiation is limited because the product is highly standardized, buyers are well informed, and technical change is not that active. At this point, it's a good idea to switch to cost leadership strategy if you can. If you still want to pursue differentiation, the differentiation switches to complementary services, things like finances, warranties, after-sale services, and things of that nature. You also know that because of this diffusion of process technology, the costs that most companies have within industry are roughly the same, right? So efficiency is at about the same level. If you want to pursue cost leadership, which is the sensible thing to do in this situation, you have to migrate to low-cost economies, right? So you have to globalize, internationalize, and we'll have a separate session probably in 2 weeks where we'll talk about internationalization in some detail. So you want to go to low-cost economies. You also know that if the industry has been around for a while, it is mature, it does have the infrastructure in place. You would think that newcomers will not necessarily go into mature industries. Well, in fact, they might. So if you think about like telecommunications, phone industry, it's been around again for over a century. It does not mean that new companies do not come in, right? They may come up with maybe a new technological idea. You have to provide access to the infrastructure to the new companies. So if you are AT&T and you own the landlines, you have to let them use it. So it actually, it may be counterintuitive, but if you are in a mature industry, you may expect some major blows from newcomers. And then obviously the nature of innovation changes once the industry matures. So you remember we talked about 5 different kinds of innovation: new product, new process, new markets, new way of organizing, and whatever else. So here, the kind of innovation you look at is you try to embrace new customer groups, which is like new markets. You try to augment or bundle different products, right? So the novelty is in bundling in the package that you present to your customers. And then rather than selling products or technologies, you offer customers solutions, which customers definitely do appreciate, but it becomes very problematic for you as a company because the demands it puts on your human resources and technologies and suppliers may far outweigh the benefits that you get from offering customers solution. Um, as the nature of competition changes away from differentiation and more towards cost leadership, strategy implementation is subject to specific forces as well. So, you definitely try to manage scale to be able to have cost advantage. Strategy formulation goes away from the frontline employees, which often happens when the industry is young and companies are young. People who interact with customers tend to be the ones who come up with ideas. So here everything migrates to the very top. Middle managers become responsible primarily for strategy implementation, right? Not so much strategy formulation. You have mechanistic structures here, functional departments, distinction between line and staff, clearly defined jobs with job roles with strong vertical reporting. So everything becomes less exciting and more efficiency oriented. So again, I would encourage you to go to the textbook to read more about that. And then finally, what do you do if your industry is facing decline? At that point, a lot of industry companies are dealing with excess capacity, right? As demand goes down, there's all this underutilized technology, capacity, facilities that just remain there that encourage firms to switch to sort of predatory pricing competition, and that's tough, right? So it's one thing if you can predict easily industry decline, you can adjust your capacity. If it's not possible or hard, or if there are barriers to exit in place, right? Maybe you have highly specialized assets that are very durable. You haven't amortized them just yet. There are costs incurred in plant closure, environmental protection and whatnot, managerial commitment to a specific line of business. You're in trouble, right? There's lack of technical change, so you cannot expect all of a sudden to win new customers by coming up with better technology. There's declining number of competitors, which may not be a bad thing for you, right? So the competitive pressures do go down. There's aging physical resources and aging human resources, right? People are not trained for those obsolete technologies. So you stuck with employees who have been trained quite some time ago. That puts new limits to what you can do. And yeah, the competition is aggressively based on price. So what do you do if that's your situation? It turns out that there are four possible strategies that you can consider. One is you try to develop a strong leadership position in a declining industry. How you do that is an open question. You probably need to invest in developing your brand, but you have to do it early on while the industry is still in the growth stage and possibly in maturity stage. If you do that, if you develop this leadership position, then you are probably the last one to fall, right? You will see a lot of other companies exit the industry while you can remain there and collect at least something from customers who are still using that obsolete product. You may try to develop a niche strategy, right? In this case, even though the industry may be declining, there may be some niches that remain strong. So there are some manufacturers of like computer chips that are supplying NASA or some of the Department of Defense manufacturers, where the technology in question has originated back in the 60s. There's been absolutely no change. The volumes are definitely not there, but because there is no more competitors who can do it, if you can manufacture a memory chip true to like really old specifications, you can charge pretty much whatever you want. Especially if your customers are, you know, organizations like NASA who spend rockets to the moon, right? It doesn't really matter much to them how much they pay for the processor. So if you find that little niche, you can be successful. Now, your growth capabilities are definitely limited, but in terms of ensuring a quality lifestyle for company owners, that is definitely a possibility. And not every company is necessarily focused so much on growth. Many are lifestyle businesses. So for those businesses, finding that niche is actually a good thing. You may also try to adopt a harvest strategy, in which case you stop reinvesting in your capabilities, your facilities at all, You simply milk them as far as they could go. You try to raise prices if possible. You do not really invest in any training or safety or anything like that. So you harvest it as much as you can. And when the industry dies, it dies. And then if you caught the industry early on in a declining stage, right? So we tend to speak about industry dynamics as if it was absolutely clear. Well, it's not. If you have your beliefs about the industry going into decline, and maybe other industry participants are not necessarily believing the same thing, that's the time when you try to divest. You try to sell your business, your facilities to someone else who wants to remain in the industry, and then with the resources that you collect, you try to pursue other opportunities. And so that pretty much covers what I had to say today about strategies in different industry contexts. Again, the business level strategies that you employ would differ depending on the the stage of industry development. You know, typically, you start up with a differentiation strategy, then the nature of competition changes towards cost leadership, and you pretty much have to respond to that pressure. And then at the end, right, you either die with the industry or you do something smart to pursue other opportunities. So that's that. Please, if you need more input on any of these things, let me know. I can post some additional materials. Otherwise, I'll have a great week and I'll see you later.